Hello, this is another one of my videos on Untitled Parker's short history of the Second World War. It's from chapter 10 on strategic bombing. This is the second video in this chapter. As mentioned in the previous video, for the British, area bombing became the norm in their bombing raids on Germany itself. Operations over German-occupied territories were officially to be confined to military targets. The resultant destruction was massive. From 1942 to 45, Bomber Command destroyed around half of the built-up areas of 79 German towns. One of the major advocates for strategic bombing was Arthur Harris, nicknamed Bomber Harris by the press, and the nickname was widely used by others. He was in charge of RAF Bomber Command from 42 through to 45. Looking for spectacular successes to justify his claims of the value of strategic bombing, Harris ordered the firebombing of the historic German towns of Lübeck and Rostock in March and April 1942. Their densely packed medieval centers were, in his words, more like a firelighter than a human habitation. Then, in May, he ordered a mass raid of over 1,000 aircraft to attack the city of Cologne, followed by further 1,000 bomber raids on Essen and Bremen. The British massively overestimated the destructive impact of these raids, but they were still substantial. In 90 minutes of bombing Cologne, the RAF had destroyed around 3,000 houses and made 45,000 people at least temporarily homeless. Note that the weight of bombs dropped by the British on Germany in 1942 was slightly less than the Luftwaffe had dropped on Britain in 1940 and 41. The impact of area bombing on the cities involved was massive, particularly if the bombing was repeated. This is the German city of Cologne as it looked by April 1945. And this is the Abeck district of Hamburg. British plans for the mass bombing of Germany relied on American support, but the US Army Air Force leaders initially disapproved of British tactics, preferring the destruction of specific targets in precision bombing carried out in daylight. For the British, this was foolish, going against their own experience of the high costs of daylight attacks on defended targets. For them, the only feasible goals were the destruction of the entire German economy and morale through night attacks on large towns and cities. The Americans believed that the British fear of German interceptor fighters could be overcome by disciplined formations of heavily armed and well-armored aircraft which could fend off German fighters. For the British, bombers needed fighter escorts if they were to survive daylight raids, and this necessarily restricted the possible range of attacks given the flying times available for fighters at that time. The development of American airpower is an important factor here. It's not one that Parker goes into. We can note four aircraft which made a major difference to the war: the B-17 Flying Fortress, which was a relatively fast, high-flying, long-range bomber with heavy defensive armament at the expense of its bomb load, the B-24 Liberator bomber, the B-29 Super Fortress bomber, which came in later, and finally the P-51, the Mustang fighter, which was able to have a longer distance to accompany bombers. This is a Flying Fortress. You'll notice that it's got gun pods in the front and back of the plane and on the roof, as it were. Those are not the technical terms. This is a Liberator. This one in the hands of an Australian crew, and the number of men there give you an idea of how many people were actually involved in flying and using all of the armaments on the plane. This is a super fortress which came into use later. And finally, this is the Mustang fighter, which proved itself so useful in the later stages of the war. Churchill was still doubtful that the war could be won solely by aerial bombing, but he was willing to accept a US Air Force bombing campaign as a means of ensuring continued American support for the war in Europe, rather than being distracted by the US Navy's preference for prioritizing the war against Japan. An American campaign of daylight bombing against Germany would also convince Marshall, the head of the US Army, of its value as a preliminary to an invasion of Northwest Europe, so agreeing with the views of Brooke and the British General Staff of the necessity of weakening German strength before such an invasion could be mounted. The makers of British and American strategy agreed on a combined bomber offensive, and at the Casablanca Conference on the 21st of January 1943, the combined Chiefs of Staff issued a directive to govern the operation of the two bomber commands, British and American, now operating in Britain. This incorporated the doctrines of both commands, the British goal of progressively destroying and dislocating the German military, industrial, and economic system, and of undermining the morale of the German people to a point where their capacity for armed resistance is fatally weakened, and the Americans' concern with precise target systems subject to the exigencies of weather and tactical feasibility. This left it open for either side to convert the other to its strategy. The Americans, under General Ira Ecker, commander of the US 8th Air Force, soon worked out an optimistic plan which they believed would win the war by destroying 6 selected target systems. Like other air forces, the Americans began by greatly overestimating their own successes, thinking, for example, that they'd shot down 223 German aircraft between July and December 1942, when the actual number appears to have been less than 8. American attacks began on targets in France and the Low Countries in 1942, and in January 1943 they bombed German targets for the first time, attacking the major naval base at Wilhelmshaven with 91 aircraft, B-17 Flying Fortresses and 20 B-24 Liberators. The British and American bombers competed in 1943, the British dropping more bombs by weight and making more sustained attacks, including one of the most horrifyingly successful of the entire war against Hamburg, where between the 24th of July and the 2nd of August there were 4 nighttime raids by the British, each with over 700 planes, and 2 smaller daytime raids by the Americans. The British used a radar jamming mass of reflecting strips to confuse German defences, enabling repeated attacks. And on the 27th of July, a shower of incendiary bombs set off fires in the central city, which emerged into a single furnace in which temperatures reached 1000 degrees centigrade. This inferno sucked in winds at hurricane force, which further united individual fires into a firestorm covering 6 square miles. Lack of oxygen suffocated those in shelters before the fires cremated them, and winds dragged children out of their parents' hands and into the fire. All told, between 40 and 50,000 people were killed. Harris repeatedly stated that the scale of devastation unleashed on Germany would soon end the war, but whilst Air Marshal Bottomley, the Deputy Chief of Air Staff, was doubtful, Hitler and the German High Command feared more the daytime precision destruction of factories than the nighttime loss of homes and people. But nevertheless, the bombing campaign continued. Although the British continued to inflict devastating blows on German cities, the German defences held, particularly in the east, with losses of 9% or more of the aircraft involved in some of the raids. It reached a point where bomber crews had a less than 50% chance of surviving the 30 sorties of their first tour of duty, let alone the 20 sorties of their second tour. German night fighters inflicted heavy casualties. As in other aspects of the war, the British were unable to persuade the Americans that their experience had given them greater wisdom. The American Army Air Force insisted on daytime precision bombing, but even over German-occupied territory, rather than the more heavily defended targets in Germany itself, German fighters inflicted heavy losses on American bombers. Direct American attacks on Germany began in earnest in July 1943, with even heavier losses of between 9 to 12% of the aircraft involved. Even the supposedly self-defending flying fortresses were destroyed in large numbers. For example, in one raid on Schweinfurt, the center of German ball bearing production, 60 out of the 229 planes which reached the target were lost. American commanders still grossly overestimated losses of German fighters, but gradually they began to realize that German fighter strength was in fact growing, and that the US had not achieved air superiority. A key development here was the development of the Mustang, the P-51B, an American aircraft first introduced in 1941 and not highly regarded, but later revamped with a British Rolls-Royce Merlin engine. This hybrid combined better performance than any other fighter of the time, with a much greater range. Production began in June 1943, but after the Schweinfurt disaster, the Americans understood the need for such an aircraft, and by May 1945, 14,000 Mustangs had been produced. When the Americans renewed their struggle with the Luftwaffe in February 1944, their bombers were now protected by the accompanying Mustang fighters. The result was a significant reduction in American losses and a massive increase in the number of German fighters which were shot down. Some 900 German planes lost in February and March 1944, a disaster for the Luftwaffe from which they never recovered. So that's all I'm going to say for the moment. Thank you very much for listening, and as always, particular thanks to my patrons for their kind support and encouragement. Without them, I wouldn't be able to make these videos. You're very welcome to support my channel, of course. Please do like, comment, and share on the videos. Subscribe if you want to be notified of future videos. It really does help. I'll give Patreon and, for the moment, PayPal links below in case you want to provide practical support. Next week, we'll continue with this summary of the chapter on strategic bombing. Have a good day.